Forum Borealis. Paradigm Expansion.
Greetings from the north, all citizens of the earth. Welcome to Forum Borealis and another program in our philosophy series called Divulging of the Elements. Now, this is a topic that should be familiar for most people. However, the general insight into it, even by most who work with it consciously through different systems, such as tarot, astrology, Kabbalah, alchemy, etc., is tragically low, as it's largely a matter of poor quality information out there, as there is not a practical or essential understanding of it in general, but rather just regurgitated ploddering of poor books based upon other books and so on. So instead of bogging you down with lots of recitations of what the elements represent, we're going to try an original approach, which is divulging examples of how they manifest in all layers of existence throughout the cosmos, coupled with having on a guest who can fill you in on the basics. Indeed, if you grasp the elemental aspects of the elements, you can work out the rest by yourself. The recurring guest chosen as my sparring partner in this discussion is Timothy Warren Hogan, who is out with a new book on exactly this subject. His main approach to it has been through ritualism and alchemy, a discipline he has worked with practically, even offered courses in lab alchemy. He used to run an Alchemy 101 course through the sanctumsanctorum.com site and have taught it in private circles as well. He learned it originally from his grandfather, Hugh Warren, who was metallurgist at Denver University, who had learned it from his father, and so on in the family line 7 generations back through great-grandfathers to Dr. and General Joseph Warren of the American Revolutionary War, who was the first Grand Master of the forming country and part of the Sons of Liberty. Of course, Mr. Hogan is an author, researcher and initiate of several different esoteric traditions within Rosicrucianism, Martinism, Freemasonry and Gnosticism. He is the Grand Master of multiple Templar lineages, including the Order of the Temple of Secret Initiates, and run the Templar Collegia, a school for personal cultivation that studies the world's cultures and spiritual traditions throughout history. Additionally, he is a former editor and has written for several periodicals over the last decade, including L'Initiation or Initiation, the New Equinox Journal, the Scottish Rite Journal and Harrodom, Ariadne's Web, and the Livingston Magazine. Furthermore, he has worked in the film and television industry as an advisor on different projects. He's appeared on numerous TV programs worldwide, as well as multiple podcasts and radio interviews. Tim Hogan is an avid traveler who has lectured all over the world in both public and private venues, at one point even speaking in 4 different continents in the span of a week. Moreover, he is run for mayor of Aurora, Colorado in a special election that he almost won, save for 2 single votes, thus coming in second out of 14 candidates. He has also been involved with science, working for the National Space Labs in Boulder, Colorado, on a number of projects. Of the big space project he's been involved in is the Advanced Composition Explorer Satellite Project in conjunction with NOAA and the Space Command, and working on a diagram of the Big Bang through first cellular life forms called the Timeline of Light with Dr. Jonathan Fowler, based on work of the cosmologist Brian Swimmer. which was presented at the United Nations for its 50th anniversary. But the perhaps weirdest project he did was working with CSETI, cataloging alien abduction recalls via hypnosis, as well as otherworldly projects in the past, including being involved in some remote viewing work for one of the heads of NASA, namely Alan Holt, which was completely under the table and was done with about 50 other remote viewers in Las Vegas in around 2000. Although it was being done on behest of NASA, they agreed to tell them everything they knew about UFOs in exchange for this work, as it was understood that nobody would believe them anyway if they told people about it. And I just realized this should be a show in itself. Maybe in the future. But his far more mundane day job is CEO of Elite Sterling Security, and Timothy is one of the founders of the cigar shop Fraternitas Cigars. Welcome back to Forum Borealis, Timothy.
It's so good to be here. Good to hear your voice again.
And ditto for you, bro. I'm so excited about this conversation today because since last time we spoke, and I was thinking of having you on for alchemy, we never seem to get around to that because in the meantime, you have published a book about one of my favorite subjects, which is the elements.
Yeah.
And so I had to have you on for this. Full disclosure, people, I've been working with the elements my whole life. I'm even teaching it in some kind of school.
Yeah, cool.
And so I figured between us we can generate an interesting conversation about it.
I have no doubt it'll be, just with your background and as mine, I'm sure we can provide a pretty full exploration of the subject.
Yeah. And what I like about your book is that on the one hand, it's like an introduction, it's like the basics, everything you need to understand the element. In fact, I think I'm going to recommend it to the pupils I have about it.
Oh, that sounds great.
But on the other hand, you don't do, the problem with many beginner books is that they're full of errors. And let's be honest, we're not relativists. We're not saying everything goes. There are certain facts and there are certain errors in life, and especially in nature. And so, I mean, it's a science in a way.
Correct, yeah.
And so the cool thing with this book, although it is an introduction, it adheres to what I would say is the correct essentials, which means that they don't have to unlearn a lot of bull that you usually have to do with introductory books. You can have this all your life if you're working with the elements, no matter if it's tarot or alchemy or astrology or whatever. You see what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. One of the reasons why I wrote it is I felt like, on the one hand, the elements are something that are used all the time in ritual around the world and in sacred texts. And they're one of the most fundamental symbols that we really begin to grasp in our consciousness as we're adapting to this world. And yet, and so many of our words come from things related to the elements, and yet so many people are really haven't given it much thought, and the ones who have just kind of parroted things that they heard somebody say, but they haven't really given it much thought. And there's a real order to them, and there's a real tradition related to the elements that has been preserved within esoteric traditions and orders and schools. They harmonize with each other. Once you understand, the science behind it, it's almost it's elemental, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't know how popular this program will be. I'm unsure because there's not really many books specifically on the elements, and certainly not many podcasts about it. So it's like you say, it's elemental. So, and all sorts of people meet it in all different approaches to different things. So on the one hand, I would assume it will be a popular show. On the other hand, it may be too esoteric. We'll see. I know for a fact that our last show, our first show maybe, was very popular. I mean, we have 200,000. I would never imagine 200,000 people would check out Gnosticism.
Yeah, I've been pleasantly surprised at the number of people who've listened to that show. I mean, in fact, I was giving a lecture in Santa Barbara, California, only about 2 months ago, and I went to check into the hotel, and the person behind the desk said, "Oh, Timothy Hogan, are you in town for a lecture?" I was like, "Yeah, I'm here. I'm here to give a lecture." And she said, "I was just listening to you the other 2 days ago on this podcast." And I was like, "What?" and it was your show.
Yeah, that's so great.
I was like, "Oh, I felt pretty. It was pretty exciting."
Hey, you hotel clerk or whatever, if you're out there, hats off. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I hope all our listeners will do that when they encounter one of the guests we have. That's so great. It's a small world in a way, but it's always nice when stuff like that happens.
It is.
They can never do that with me, because I'm semi-anonymous. So I can never experience that thing.
Yeah.
But that's okay. We're into it for the ideas, not the personalities. Okay, let's launch this thing then.
Okay.
And by the way, listeners, if some of you don't know our show and our format, we do long-form conversational interviews. So if some of you are annoyed that I'm talking, it's scripted, it's a part of the thing. Timothy is aware of it, and our listeners enjoy it. Okay, so I'm not being a rude host by putting my 2 cents on the table. This is, I suggest to new listeners, you just regard it as being a fly on the wall, listening in on 2 friends having a conversation, rather than imagining that you're an audience in a hall listening to a lecture. We do the conversational thing. So if you're good with that, we can launch.
Sounds good.
Now, I don't know where to start because there's so much to say. But if we look at your book, you start with introducing the elements and relieving to see that you do it in the right order, because they have a right order, like you said, and they also have an internal dynamic that is important, and we'll get back to that. But you start introducing them: earth, water, air, fire.
Yeah. I mean, if we our understanding of the elements initially comes from our observation of nature itself. If you take any element or any type of physical thing, let's say a piece of wood, just because it's easy to illustrate. Mm-hmm. A piece of wood, it starts out as this physical thing, this earth-based thing. And if you start to heat that piece of wood, it'll then start to excrete oils. It'll start to excrete moisture, right? Which is would be the water element, the liquid component within it. And then those water or oils, those liquid elements, with further heat, then start to turn to steam, or they start to turn to gases, which is a type of air. I mean, air is just a gas. And from that, the gases can actually then catch on fire. Mm. And so it turns into it goes to that fire aspect. So I mean, that's how we observe it in nature. And it could be argued that from that observation that esoteric systems, early mystery schools, early traditions, noticed that there was a level of density to these different states, with Earth being the most dense state and fire being, or this plasma state being the least dense. And and so they would set up systems of initiation based on these, going from the most heavy, if you will, to the lighter, or more ethereal. And they would set up, they described our level of identification in terms of our consciousness with how we associate ourselves with the world related to these elements, so that like Earth represented things that where we identify with physical things. I mean, we all know people who all they do is live for new titillations, and they're just trying to get lots of physical things. And that's just what they live for. They don't even see beyond their physical.
Obsessed with Earth, huh?
They're totally obsessed with the Earth, exactly. And then as one reflects on their nature a little bit more and their constitution of who they are, there's this recognition that we also have this emotional component to ourselves, and our emotions oftentimes influence how we react in the physical world. Mm-hmm. And the physical world generates emotion. And these emotions were really representative of water. It was believed that water represented this emotional nature, and that just as like when you're upset and you can start crying when you're sad, there's water being released from you, but beyond that, we've all heard the expression of drowning in your emotions. Mm-hmm. This idea of being so caught up in your emotions that you sink in them like they're water, Mm-hmm. So these ideas were related to water. And then once you understood you had an emotional side to your nature, from that you could also build an intellectual and a better understanding of things of the mind. And what is mind? What is consciousness? And is it, once you have your emotions under control, then you can direct the energy from that into, to higher thinking. And so that these things of the mind were associated with air. They're less tangible, there are thoughts. But consciousness itself, if all you have to do is hold your breath long enough and you'll stop thinking, So it was, there was this tie between breath and air and thought and thinking and consciousness. Mm-hmm. And then from that, there was this other step, which was seen to be associated with fire, which was light, and it was heat, and it was the will, and it was the volition to do things and to make things happen. And it was also this symbol of spiritual illumination that transcended just our everyday thinking. And that it was in some ways the prime mover that allowed the other states of matter to it took the heat from fire to get the earth to heat up, to liberate the water.
Yeah, we see in fire a very important key there, that fire can actually influence all the other elements.
Yeah, it's like the action. It's the transmuter. It's what transforms things.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's important what you say about nature, because either we think this is something that is inherited from an ancient antediluvian civilization, or if we think it's picked up by just observing nature, because in all the ancient cultures, in all the ancient systems, they agreed about the base, with one exception. We can come back to that, but they agreed about the basic nature and outline of the elements.
Yeah, that's right.
And so it either suggests a common source, maybe very, very old, or it just suggests that these nature-based philosophies, which are the most ancient of all thought systems, came to the same conclusions because they were dealing with the same corpus, basically. And so, and maybe it's a question of both an inheritance and a rediscovery, if you like.
Oh, sure.
And alchemy is a very good approach here, because your excellent description of the different states is unquestionable, is what happens. We have the solid state, which is regarded as earth. We have the fluid state associated to water, just like the feelings, right?
Yep.
And we have the gaseous state associated to thoughts. You know, I often use in my meditation course, I used to say, imagine that thoughts are like clouds.
Yeah.
And if you're going to clear your mind, you're going to have a clear sky, right? So that the fourth element, the fire, the sun, can shine through. And that we can maybe call plasma state.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you know, the alchemists, they observed too that through any type of transmutation that you were doing, whether you were working with metals or whether you were working with herbs, but when you're talking physical lab alchemy, you had to take it through certain stages in order to transform it to get the healing aspects out. And so, for example, the first thing you had to do is you had to find something from the earth that it was of value. So you'd find an herb, say. Let's say an herb. We'll start with an herb, but again, it could be metal if you're talking metallic alchemy. But you'd start out taking this earth element, whatever it was. And from that, you'd then have to do, the next stage was called the digestion stage. And really what this digestion stage was, is it was, you took that earth element and you put it in a vessel that was filled with a fluid that was designed to break down the earth to a certain degree. So if you were working with an herb, you might use water, or you could even use alcohol. If you were working with a metal, you would stick it in an acid. But either way, you were taking the earth element and sticking it into a liquid that would digest the earth element, just like our stomach digests food. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it would break it down. It would start to liberate the oils and some of the more subtle aspects of the earth element, the more subtle nature from the husk of the earth element, whether it be, whatever. From that, and in some instances, you could even ferment at that point. So you're starting to change the liquid matrix itself into like an alcohol that contained the oils. From there, so you went from earth to water, or from a solid to a liquid operation. Then from there, you had to distill that liquid. Distillation involved heating the liquid so it would turn into a gas. Mm. And when you turn it into a gas, it would then condense into another vessel. And when you do that, you're collecting the subtle elements of that liquid. Mm-hmm. So you've liberated the subtle elements from the earth into the liquid, and then you're distilling the liquid and capturing those subtle things even more through this gas operation. And then finally, the last stage was you still had this remnant earth body that was left behind that you had to calcinate down with fire in order to liberate the secret salts that were in it.
Right.
So through all of these processes, you're extracting the what was called the sulfur, which was the oils. You were extracting the mercury, which was the alcohol, and you were extracting the salts through these operations. And these were, of course, the three, oils, alcohol, and salts don't go bad. So they were the three immortal natures that you were capturing to recombine in this new body. But you had to go through these processes of operations using water on earth or liquid on earth, and then distillation with air, turning it into gas, and then using fire to take it to these higher levels. So, I mean, the alchemy's there. Those are the steps of processes of earth, water, air, and fire in the alchemical lab operations. And I think that it's also possible that these sciences were passed down from an earlier civilization, perhaps, and then that idea was incorporated in ritual in order to preserve it and relate it to the human consciousness itself. And the human body, because let's face it, if you look at the human body, I mean, the abdomen contains all the liquid components of the human body.
Yeah.
So it's associated with water. The chest takes in the air into the lungs. Mm-hmm. So it's associated with air, and then the head itself, emanates heat from it. In fact, 80% of your heat comes from your head. And, the brain and the electrical forces of the brain and the nervous system, I mean, they're kind of fire force in themselves. So there's this progression in that. And I believe this is why it's preserved. If you look at the Hebrew Kabbalistic tradition, they divided the body according to these three divisions, with the fourth would have been the generative organs, going from with the idea that they had their three mother letters of Mem, Aleph, and Shin, which corresponded to water, air, and fire, respectively. Yeah. The Gnostics would do their baptisms through different levels of awakening. They would baptize with water, and then later with air or breath, and then finally with fire. And usually they would use like an anointing with oil, because oil catches on fire.
The first baptism is the birth itself, or you could say when you die, earth to earth.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But what you've alluded to here is that we really, because many people misunderstand. They, are you going on about elements from the medieval ages? No. Today we know the elements are. And then they refer to these periodic, the elements of physics.
Oh yeah, periodic table. Yeah,
that's a big misunderstanding. It's actually a terminology problem here, because the reason the ancients called them elements, and it's really tragic that the periodic table particles are called elements. But the reason is the same, because the physicists call them the elements, the periodic table, because it's elemental in building up matter.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, when we talk about elements, or spiritual disciplines, esoteric disciplines refer to the elements, they're talking about principles in existence that manifests at every level of existence, not just in the physical world, but also in the physical world, as Tim here has given illustrations of. And if you can understand that, we're dealing with 4 cosmic forces, from microcosmos to macrocosmos, the hermetic axiom as above, so below.
Yeah. Yes.
But also as within, so without, in consciousnesses, in everything, then you'll see why they can truly be called elements, because they're building reality, not just merely physical, dense, materium, but everything. And during this talk today, I'll throw in a lot of examples of this fourfoldness.
Great.
Because I think it's easier for people to understand this fourfoldness if they get examples of how it manifests. Otherwise, they have to read a lot of books and kind of, by heart kind of thing. Oh, earth means this, fire means this. No, it's much easier if you understand them. If you just recognize them in nature as principles.
Yeah.
In fact, I think I'll go through a few examples in the physical world, in addition to what you have talked about, so people can see this fourfoldedness in the materium. And then we can say, for example, that you have the 4 powers in astronomy. That's very interesting. And I hate these terms that scientists use, because they're very bad in explaining what we're talking about. But you have so-called electromagnetism, which is like water. It's what's permeating. It's like waves going through the universe. Then you have gravitation, which is earth, which is kind of
ties you to the earth.
Exactly, for example, right? Attracting. Yeah. Then you have, and here comes the bad terms, you have so-called weak and strong nuclear force. But it's interesting if you understand what it is, because the strong nuclear force is fire. That's what you make an atom bomb out of. That's when you take the fire in everything and just unleashes it. But then you have the so-called weak nuclear force, which is kind of the space between the atom nucleus and the surrounding particles. So here we have 4 simple examples of huge forces in nature that corresponds to the elements. We could go to the particles themselves. According to my research, I would say that carbon, which builds up the body, is earth, and I have arguments for it in terms of the protons, the electrons, but that's too technical. We don't have to take that here on Earth, but we can talk about it privately if you're interested.
Yeah, interesting.
Then you have the second one is water, which is hydrogen. And then you have the air principle, which is oxygen. And then you have the fire principle, which is nitrogen. So again, 4 examples of these 4 powers in nature. Before I let you comment, I have a couple of more examples.
Yeah, sure.
You mentioned the body. So I'd say if you regard the organism, you could say the atomic structure is based upon fire principles. And in their lower frequency, they make molecules, which corresponds to the air principles. In their lower frequency, they make cellular structures, which corresponds to water. And in their lower frequency, we get the organism structure, which is obviously the body itself.
Yeah, right.
And then we could say, if you dissect the body, we could say that the glands and the nerve structure corresponds to fire. The organe structure corresponds to air. The fluid structure corresponds to water. And the muscle, tissue, bone structure corresponds to earth.
Correct. Yeah. And actually a number of traditions, including the Tibetan traditions in particular, have divided everything up exactly like that.
Nice. You see, it's just confirmation. So I think whether this is an ancient, I mean, even if the ancient had this science, they wouldn't pull it out of their heinies. They would do as everyone does. Observe nature and draw the right conclusion. Because the book of nature is really the answer book, isn't it, of existence.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I talk about at the beginning of my book is this idea that where does symbolism come from? Symbolism comes from initially, I mean, it's the most primitive language, right? I mean, it comes from before you even knew how to talk, before you even understood words, when you were just a baby, you were dreaming. And these dreams were just symbolic representations of things for you to learn. And from that, we later developed words to describe these things. But almost at the very core of our first observations of this world about who we are and what the forces are that are impacting us in the world, they tie directly back to these elements. And so it really is who we are. It's what our it's the root of our consciousness, how it expresses itself, and all other symbolic forms and ideas of navigating in this universe tie back to these ideas, these root elements. I mean, because it's our base mode of symbolic language, and probably it would be fair to say that these states of matter are probably pretty universal. If there's other life out there in the universe, even if they come from a different type of planet than Earth, they probably still have similar states of matter that they've dealing with, that they're composed of, that likewise form the basis of their symbolic system.
Absolutely. I mean, they have to, I mean, even if they look like the weirdest creatures, they have to be based upon the same cosmic laws. They have to have life force to be alive. Yeah. They have to have consciousness to be sentient. They have to have a vehicle to move in this universe. That's Earth, right?
Yeah.
And they have to have some kind of soul, in order to have all these three bodies, earth, water, air. They have to have some fire. So, these are truly universal. It's as universal as numbers.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
And in many ways, I'd say, and yin-yang is tied to this too, because that's the plus and the minus, the masculine and the feminine. And a wise man said in the manifested world, duality, or this plus minus, the polarity, exists only conceptually, but it's really what you call it, like a bridge. Mediating stage.
Oh, yeah, mediating stage.
Mediating stage from the inception to the manifestation, or creation rather. So you have the inception and the idea, then you have the mediating state, then you have the creational state, which is equivalent to water, and then you have the manifesting state, which is equivalent to Earth. And so they say in this reality we live in, meaning this three-dimensional, actually four-dimensional at time, right? There are 4 dimensions, one for each element. In this world, 2 doesn't really exist. Polarity doesn't really exist. The wise man said, every time you think you're dealing with 2, you're really dealing with 4.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure.
Right?
Right.
And that's the point. So, not to say 2 isn't, it's a concept, and you need 2 to get 4, right? But the point is, if you see manifestations of duality out there, you're really just seeing manifestations of fourfoldness if you really look.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, and one of the things that intrigued me, I've done a lot of traveling all over the world, and I've met with different traditions, different cultures, different esoteric schools. And I found that these elements are the one absolutely universal idea, and is incorporated and illustrated in all of the ritual ceremonies and in all the initiations of all of these different schools everywhere in the world. I mean, I even traveled down to the Yucatan and met with Mayan, and these Mayan tribes, they would do this initiation where they would bring in the candidate, the person who was being initiated into the sacred space, and they had a central altar, and then they had 4 other altars, mini altars that were orientated towards the 4 directions.
Yeah.
And they would circumambulate the candidate or move the candidate around the ritual space, and he would offer sacrifices of the 4 elements at each of the altars. So there was an earth altar, and there was a water altar, and there was an air altar, and then there was a fire altar. And the central altar kind of represented the 5th element, the quintessence.
We'll get to the 5th element later.
Yeah.
I have it scheduled. There's so much to say about it. We'll not confuse them about that yet.
Very, very good.
But it's true. You can't have 4 without a 5th.
Yeah, that's right. So, but the fact that they would do this, it was something that I had encountered literally all over the world with different esoteric groups. And here were these people in the jungle who didn't even speak.
Right.
They didn't even, technically they were in the jungles of Mexico, but they didn't even speak Spanish, which is the main language in Mexico, because they're so isolated. And yet, here they are doing these rituals that are in many ways identical to other ceremonies done within European systems.
Yeah.
And incorporating these elements. I mean, this is unbelievable.
Yeah, and I can attest to the fact that you seriously have traveled the world and hooked up with different spiritual traditions. That's like one of your hallmarks.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's interesting, the Don Miguel Ruiz, I think is his name, is a Toltec. Yeah. I read some of his books, very based on the 4 elements, again in harmony with the Tibetans, with the Hermetics, with the Sufis, with the Kabbalists. Yes, it's universal. And I gave some example of the fourfoldness in matter or in space, if you like. But you have them even in time. You have, for example, the 4 diurnal times.
Yes,
right?
Yes, that's correct.
Morning, evening.
Yep.
Yeah. You have the 4 seasons of the year, obviously. That's so obvious.
Yes.
And just a clue, people, you can actually figure out the elements if you understand their nature. If I say that morning is fire, then you know the rest. If I say that spring is fire, then you have enough to know the rest. And we have the 4 stages of life.
Yes.
And again, it begins with fire. That's the principle of number 1. Here's another clue, people, if you want to work with the elements. 1 corresponds to fire, 2 to air, 3 to water, 4 to earth.
Yeah, that's right. And the seasons, too, in particular, when you're talking about time, I mean, that's probably the easiest one to relate to, just because it's, you also have the extreme temperature changes with each of the 4 seasons.
And in ritual, what's very important in ritual? That's to do with space. But what's very important in sacred space?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but what's very important in a temple?
Well, like directions.
Exactly.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And orientating.
Yeah, east, west, etc.
Correct. Yeah.
So that's another example of it in space. Now it's interesting. You mentioned, we can't go without air. Oh. if you regard the average of how long you can go without food, physical substance, that's approximated to 40 days.
Yeah.
If you approximate how long you can go without water, again, food is obviously earth, right? Without water, that's 4 days. The average of how long you can be without air is 4 minutes. We see here a hierarchy of, should I say, essentiality, right?
Yeah.
And lo and behold, when it comes to temperature, which is a manifestation of light and fire, 4 seconds is average. I'm not saying if you go from 37 to 36, you probably survive more than 4 seconds there. But if you go from the temperature you need to be alive, and then let's say 30 degrees off, you'll die in 4 seconds, man.
Yeah, that's right.
So we see here a hierarchy of needs too. Fire is the most important, then air. All are important, of course, but and then water, and the most tolerance we have is then earth.
Yeah, that's right.
40 days.
That's right. Yeah.
Pretty interesting, yeah.
Really interesting. Yeah, and well. Yeah. Completely right on.
And you know me, I'm a Greco-Egyptian fetishist, right? So if you look at ancient initiates, isn't it interesting, Tim, that the one we know as Democrit, the fragments of his teachings or writings are very focused on earth.
Yes.
The dominant fragments of Thales is most concerned with water. The dominant of Anaximander, you probably know this.
Yes, yeah.
Air, right?
Correct.
And then Heraclit.
Yeah, sure, fire. Yeah.
Exactly. And then Pythagoras, ether, the fifth element.
Yeah, that's right.
And enter Empedocles, who talks about the 4 roots, which is just another word for the elements.
Yeah.
He kind of was equally concerned with all 4.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
So you have one enlightened initiate in ancient Greece for each element, then one for the 5th and one for all of them. I love that one.
You got it. Well, that's right. One of the things that I write about too is if we look at the Egyptian mystery, the Egyptian rites of the myths associated with the god Osiris and Isis, and which was the cornerstone of their theology, their mythology. In the story of Osiris, he's tricked by his brother Set, who's not a nice guy, and he's chopped up just like we might chop up an herb, right? If we're doing an alchemical operation, and he's thrown into the Nile, which is of course the symbol for water. And then he's washed up. Some say the water gets absorbed into a tamarisk tree or some sort of a sacred bush, and is turned into a pillar. But Isis goes out looking for Osiris, and when she finds him, she turns herself into a bird, and she starts flying around him, giving invocations to try to bring him back from the dead. So it went from earth to water to air, with her turning into a bird. And then she lights candles or oil lamps and burns incense. And with the help of the healing goddess Sekhmet, they raise Osiris from the dead. So it literally went earth, water, air, fire.
Yeah, because you need all 4 to be in existence.
That's right, and through the drama of his story goes through those stages, and then he's raised to this new perspective, right? I mean, he went from the pieces are regathered back into the oneness, and I mean it's a it's a great allegory, both alchemical allegory for operations, but also for consciousness, but how it has to go through these stages. And it's no coincidence that, in my opinion, of course, Pythagoras, he studied in Egypt for years and years, and he came back, and he's the one who coined the term philosophy. And these ideas were passed on. It's interesting too. I was, I've done quite a bit of traveling in the Middle East, in particular, and meeting with Druze communities, the Tawhid Muhaddin Druze. They celebrate Pythagoras. Pythagoras is one of their prophets in their tradition. They're a Gnostic tradition, but they venerate Pythagoras as one of their top prophets. And in fact, their symbol, the Druze star, which is five-pointed star, one of the points of their star is they actually can attribute to Pythagoras, which is
that's an old connection. That must be an old connection.
Very, very old connection. I mean, they've been doing that for. Well, we know they go back, the rituals that they're practicing now go back at least 2,000 years, or at least 1,000 years, but they claim they came out of Egypt originally a long time ago.
That's the same, Pythagoras said the same.
Yeah. And later, philosophers like Aristotle even wrote entire treatises on the different four elements.
Yeah, that's based on Plato, but I never regarded him as an initiate. But he was a pupil of Plato's school, so everything lucid I get from Aristotle, I attribute to Plato.
Yeah, sure. Sure.
But you're right, he is known for having one of the most survival treatises about this topic, one of the oldest is from him. But you touched the key there, because Pythagoras, like Plato, and like Herodot, and like Plato's ancestor Solon, Yeah. Four Greeks we know that got access to the Egyptian mysteries. Those four chaps, if they brought back this thing from Egypt, and we know from what you said in the Isis story, but also from other stuff that the Egyptians were aware of the four elements. But then we have the interesting thing that the Indian tradition of Ayurveda, for example, and the Egyptian, we know that historically they have been designated as two survival colonies of Atlantis. So already there we see a hint of an older understanding of nature that has survived, fortunately. Yeah,
that's right. And it seems to be. I mean, when you trace things back to these elements, and one of the things that really fascinated me, it's a little off topic, but not really, as I travel around the world and I meet with these different traditions that have all passed on these rituals that are all based on the elements. But all of these traditions have these same myths of surviving this flood in antiquity. And that most of them have a legend of either they themselves came from a previous place that passed on these rituals with the elements, or they have legends of people coming from the sea, or gods coming from the sea after this flooding and delivering these rituals to them.
Yeah.
And that they continued to pass on thereafter. And the fact that we find these same rituals on both sides of the Atlantic and all over the world, with even the same names being used for a lot of things, and the same rituals being done, the same secret handshakes being used, and this progression with the elements, really seems to suggest, in my opinion, that if we're talking Atlantis, it's very
Could you repeat that? Your sound went off.
Yeah, I was saying that if we're looking at Atlantis, then to me, it seems very clear that the elements were a fundamental part, had to have been a fundamental part of the Atlantean teachings, or at least something that they felt had to be preserved and passed down to all of these other traditions. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we wouldn't be encountering it the same in the rituals of all of these different traditions all around the world that are similar.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it had to have gone back to a source, and the elements themselves, we can speculate. Elements are fundamental of observing nature, but the fact that these rituals are identical and the secret handshake is identical, and
exactly.
That suggests that it was passed on, and that earlier culture valued these elements so much that they tried to preserve it and codify it within, these ritual ceremonies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you do touch a little from not just the Hermetic, you also go into the Indian approach in your book, alchemy. It's funny, you say the flood, the world going under. The world has 4 elements in how it goes under too, 4 catastrophes.
Yeah.
You have earthquakes, obviously.
Yeah, correct.
You have floods. I don't even have to say which elements these belong to, right?
Yeah.
Then you have storms, or maybe we could say meteorites, stuff from the sky.
Yeah.
And then you have wildfire.
That's right.
There was one point that half of the globe were burning. This is in the Indian myths. In the oldest scriptures we know, they talk about huge forest fires in the world.
Oh, yeah. The Ramayana, the Mahabharata, for sure.
And science has confirmed it because they go down layers, right? And they found this layer that fits in time with what the Indian says. And they can say, wow, here's been a huge fire on the earth. So we survived that. That's like a little comfort in these times where the rainforests are burning artificially, by the way. Arsenic.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Horrible.
Yeah. Well, and I hear that there's been some burning up in the Arctic too.
Oh, that I didn't know. But I do know the rainforest is burning both in South America, which is what hasn't reached the news, but even more so the rainforest in Africa.
Yeah.
That gets no news. And these are the lungs of the earth, people. So you should care when people burn them down for profit, the multinational corporations. Anyway, let's move on. That's depressing. It's its own show. Let's move on. So you said that it was also connected to the mind, and I want to give examples of that too.
Yeah, sure.
For example, I'll say that the 5 perceptions can be divided in, because I know you're aware of the frequency of each perception. So if you start with the lowest, which is tactile, that has the lowest number of hertz, and that corresponds to earth. Above that, you find taste, which corresponds to water, and that has a little higher frequency. Then interesting, the 5th element comes in the middle as some kind of balance, which is hearing. And folks, they say the first perception sense to work in a new made is hearing. That's already as a fetus.
Interesting.
And the last to go is also the hearing. So that's pretty interesting. That's why the Tibetans whisper into the ear of the newly deceased up till, I think, 3 days after the fact. Yeah. Then if you go in a higher frequency, you come to the range of visible light, what we can perceive as sight. Before that you have smelling. Yeah, that's before. And smell, by the way, for the longest time they argued, no, that's not vibrations. But the perfume industry has done great because they want to find cheap ways to reproduce smells, right?
Yes.
So they have done a lot of research, and now we know, and I have even their charts, and it's interesting that each sense can also be divided into 4 plus 1. So we have smell, and then we have sight, which is fire, obviously. So all the 5 elements there connected to our consciousness.
Yeah, that's
but then
right.
again, you can zoom in. Let's take taste, for example. I'll argue that sweet is water, energizing, that earth is bitter, and bitter is base, obviously, right? In chemistry, it's the fundament.
Yep.
The opposite of earth, obviously, is acid, sour,
Yep.
which is air. And then you have salt, which is fire. And just think of salt dehydrates, right? So, because the clue here is that water and fire are opposites, and earth and air is opposite. So, in the old days, they didn't have fridges, so they salted stuff to preserve life force. So you see the logic here. It goes again and again and again in everything. And a little later, we go more into the principles of each element themselves, because if you know those principles, you can recognize them in the fourfoldness without even having read a book about the elements.
Yeah, that's right.
But I say perception in itself, that I gave example of now, belongs to earth. I'll say emotions to water, thoughts to air, and creativity
Yeah.
to fire.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you said something similar in your book. And I would say symbols are the language of fire.
Yeah, and if we were to, another way to look at it too is if we look at like Jungian archetypes, and how archetypes manifest at different levels. When you're talking about fire is kind of like this magician archetype, right? I mean, that's the magician's the creative person who's able to pull things out of nothing. Mm-hmm. And air is kind of like this warrior archetype, right? Who goes out and swinging the sword and so on and so forth, and is out conquering things and taking things head on. Mm-hmm. I mean, which is a very mental process, Water is more of a martyr archetype. It's more of a emotional sense of nurturing and
protecting.
And Earth is more of like the orphan archetype, right? Is the sense of perception where you feel like the whole world is either providing for you or is denying you. You've been denied things that you need physically, mm-hmm. and
or provided things you need physically.
Right. And so there's these archetypes of the orphan and the martyr, the warrior, and the magician. Mm-hmm. They play in relation to these elements.
Yeah, if you're using tarot, if you're using tarot, I'd rather say air is more than the warrior, because the fire can have warrior aspects. I say air is more like the Pope.
Yeah.
The ruler, the one who dictates the structures. This is how it. Yeah. This is the dogma. This is how it's supposed to be. These are the laws.
Yeah, maybe a better thing for the air would be the wanderer. The idea of the wanderer, the one who's willing to go out and explore. To look at things.
To cover space.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, but in this regard, like from like a tarot perspective, Earth would be associated with the discs or the coins, and water would be associated with the cups.
Careful now, because one of the big disagreements in esoterica is this exact symbolism, and I suspect we may have different, but that's cool, because then we can exchange ideas. But go on.
Yeah.
Go on.
So the water would be the cups, because obviously they store the liquid.
Yeah.
the swords would be the air, right? Because they literally swing swords in the air. It's and then
here's where we depart, because you're going to say wands are fire.
Yeah, because the wand is the creative act, right? That's the fire. It's, in fact, that's why wands are always associated with creating like fire out of nothing.
Yeah, but I will. I don't know how much time we should use on this, but it's interesting, and it's something that people are concerned about. This is the main way to see it in tarot, but there is a smaller current, which, if you go further back, and remember, tarot is a leak from the esoteric world. Yeah. So I don't care what 90% of the books say today, because they are just,
sure. I agree.
Written. But here's another way to look at it. Swords are forged in fire, and swords are like they are sharp, they are no nonsense, they cut through everything like fire does. It's a transforming element. Sword is also the most powerful. The reason I ascribe wands to air is that, first of, wands is tree. It comes from the tree which breathes in order to grow.
Right.
And wands are also a symbol of, it's a polar thing, like air, like two. It goes two equal sides. It's also a symbol of rulers and priests and teachers, because it's like, I give you the wand, now you have the power. That's the because yes, fire is more powerful in that it begins thing, but the fire isn't a ruler, because to have a ruler you have to have someone who's willing to cover space, to cover air, to go around in the land, to lay down the laws, lay down the doctrines, the teachings, which is a very mental concept, and both are masculine, obviously, so both are powerful, both have plus. So that's just very superficial why I adhere to the
that's interesting.
Other minority view that swords are fire and wands are air. But it has no practical difference if you used to, using one symbolism in your tarot. It's okay. You can go on doing it.
Sure. Yeah. There's no dogma. That I liked what you had to say too. Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I think it's interesting, but these are symbols that we need to apply to ourselves. So, yeah. Yeah,
well, see, between you and me, I think you should convert immediately over to that scheme. Because the other one is the exoteric one. You can't afford carrying that. But do you work with tarot at all? I don't, but do you?
Not really. I mean, I recognize it more as a symbolic system related to Kabbalah.
Yeah.
But, I'm more interested in it just from a symbolic system, but I don't do readings or anything like that.
And the magician, I believe, the problem with the magician is that he has both a sword and a wand, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. He has the creative will, though. I mean, in a way, I had a friend of mine once who he was very into. He was into trying to learn how to do things that ancient people, like really ancient people, like Stone Age people used to do. So he would try to figure out how to make arrows out of, or make
arrows. That's air.
Yeah, make arrowheads. Yeah, arrows are sure. He'd do other things like this, but one of the things he used to point out was when you go to make fire, the creative process of making fire, whether you're rubbing sticks together, or whether you're adding flint, rock to steel, or any of these things, there's this process where you have to collect the earth, and you have to remove the moisture, and you have to create the spark, and you have to add the air to it.
It needs it to breathe, because fire needs the three other bodies in order to manifest.
That's right. It's almost like a life of itself. It feeds off of the earth, and it breathes the the air, and it has it needs the fuel.
Yeah, in science they say it's a fourfold process to manifest fire. Again, you need the heat, fuel, oxygen, and you need what they call the chain reaction.
Yeah,
that's the 4 elements to manifest fire. Again.
Yeah.
A fourfold, beautiful symbolism here, huh?
That's right.
So thank you for giving me that idea. And when you mention tarot, we can't get away from 2 other factors. One, you could look at the playing cards. Right. And I'm going to give you a clue to understanding. After the break, Tim will give you the second clue. But the first clue is to understand that we're talking about polarities. We're talking about masculine and feminine. We have 2 masculine, we have 2 feminine. And so you see on the playing cards, folks, you see the 2 black cards and the 2 red cards. Already there you understand that, okay, 2 of them has to be earth and water, and the other 2 has to be fire and air. And if I give you the following clue, if I say fire is spades, then you should be able to work out the rest. And then you will know that the opposite of fire obviously is water. And you will also know the other masculine is clubs, because that's the other black one. And again, it's a flower, so it needs to breathe. Whereas spades is kind of like a arrow thing, like a sharp thing, like the sword, like number 1. Then you have heart, which is, you can have this as a association. Heart is emotions, right?
Yep.
Ergo water.
Yep. It pumps the blood too, which is a liquid.
Exactly. And then you have diamonds, which is square,
and
which is earth.
And which are dug out of the earth.
Ah, exactly. I didn't think of that. Yeah. Good point.
Yeah.
And the other thing...
generated by the earth, yeah.
Pardon?
They're generated naturally by the earth.
Exactly. That's what they are. They are the most long produced from coal, isn't it?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Which is burnt matter. So it's dead as coal, and then it gets born again in Mother Earth. and Earth is also associated to birth. That's beautiful. Yeah. I mean the feminine process of giving birth, not initiating stuff. Obviously, that's fire. But we have to point to one other interesting thing, and that's the wheel of tarot. I have it in front of me, and it says tarot, you know? Yeah. And that can be divided into the following 5 elements. First off, you have rota, which means wheel. And rota is the oldest symbol in the world, folks. You find it all over the world in all cultures, which again suggests an insight into the fourfoldness of existence. So you have rota hidden in that word. Then you have Torah, which is obviously the book of the law in Kabbalah.
Correct. Yeah.
Then you have orator, which is one who masters the gift of speech.
Yep.
That's air, I'll say, because that's mental, right? Word.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're speaking, right?
Speaking, right? Communication, which is mental. Then you have aura, which is prayer or invocation. It also can mean horizon. And that's a very feminine thing, a devotion. Oh, I hope I give my heart in this so that I can receive aura, right? You have to, you cannot pray without devotion.
That's right. That's right.
Right? And then you have O-R, which is to express a ritual formal. Formal, what's that in English? Recipe, maybe?
Recite?
Yeah, Recital? Formula. Yeah. So those are beautifully hidden in the wheel of tarot.
Yeah, well, and or is also kind of the root of the word for gold, too. One of the old words for gold.
Oh, without just O-R, I thought gold was A-U-R.
Well, it is A-U-R, but it's related to O-R.
Ah, interesting. That's so cool.
In fact, that's where that's where mining ore, the word mining come from. Yeah.
All right. Of course.
Yep.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah. There's another thing I started thinking about too. This is more from a Masonic perspective within Freemasonry. Mm-hmm. But one of the fundamental teachings related to at the foundation of Freemasonry is that any entered apprentice learns about is the they're made a mason is they're exposed to the idea of the four cardinal virtues. So that, and the three heavenly virtues. And the three heavenly virtues, of course, were faith, hope, and charity. And then the cardinal virtues were temperance, prudence, fortitude, and justice.
Exactly.
And those four cardinal virtues are regularly depicted within Masonic systems as they're usually depicted as women. And if you look up any picture of the cardinal virtues, you'll find this online very easily. But the point I want to make is that these cardinal virtues were also associated with the elements. So, for example, temperance. The image of temperance is a woman pouring water from one container into another container, or sometimes from a jug into a bowl, and this is, of course, the symbol for water. Prudence is holding a mirror and is also holding a snake, which represented earth. Of course, the snake was always a symbol for the earth because it crawls closest to the earth.
What was the other thing she held? A mirror?
And a mirror, yeah. So she's looking at the mirror. So this idea,
reflection, right?
It's a reflection of herself.
Yeah, the illusions. The Buddhists say Maya. Earth is Maya.
Right, Maya, correct. And then is holding this. It's like it's actually the rod of Eucalyptus. It's what's used to heal, right? The rod with the serpent, which is also became a symbol for the medical profession, and
people often confuses it with Hermes stuff.
Correct, yeah, which is the caduceus.
Which has two snakes, right?
Two snakes, but in both instances, it's like the main things you have there is you have the stick, and then you also have the snake. And the idea is you throw the stick down, the snake wraps around it. It's bound to earth like that. And interestingly, that's also. Of course, one of the miracles of Moses, right? I mean, he
that's right.
He turns his staff into a serpent, and then back into a staff again in the ways that the Egyptian priests knew how to do, which was probably all symbolic. But anyhow, so this is the symbol for prudence, which is associated with earth.
But Moses also divided the waters.
He did divide the waters, yeah for sure. Yep.
So that's the water element.
And he saw the burning bush, right?
Right. Yeah.
All the elements are there.
Yeah. But go on with the four virtues.
Yeah. So then justice is seen holding the scales up in the air.
Oh, that has to be air.
Right. And then she's also seen holding a sword,
Oh, she is. Okay.
So she's got both the sword and the scales. And so...
But I'm not bothered by her sword, because air, in order to maintain the law, needs help of fire. It needs...
for sure, absolutely.
But the fire is like the threat. That's like military. USA, in order to dominate the world as they do, they need a military in the back of the hand, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly
as a threat if they don't get their will. So I do regard sword as will. And more air as the word that expresses the will, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yep. And then fire is associated with fortitude, and fortitude, she's depicted all dressed in yellow, and red, and she's wearing the helmet of.
Hang on, yellow and red? What did you say?
Correct. Yellow and red, yeah. And she's holding she has the helmet of Pallas Athena.
Of course, yeah, that has to be fire.
Yeah, which is, and it's, of course you have to you can only forge armor in fire to begin with. So each of these four elements are depicted in the four cardinal virtues that the tradition.
Yeah, because it's so universal, because it's the symbolism.
Yep.
So symbols is a very pure way to understand deeper truths, because it condenses it.
That's right.
And you can, it doesn't even have to be visual symbols. It can be poetic, mythical symbols, like in magic and medieval ages, they talk about, what is it, the salamanders and the...
Yeah, that's right.
What's it there?
So salamander comes from, the salamander, which was like this lizard that lived in the fire.
Right, fire.
But it was this was a play on words that came from Sol and Mandra, the Greek word. So Sol meant salt, and Mandra meant stable. So the word salamandra meant stable salts, and that's what, when you're doing alchemical operations, with the last stage of fire, when you calcinate things down, that's where you extract the stable salts out of the experiment. Mm-hmm. So it was actually alluding to the process of calcination that you needed to do in order to...
What are the three other elements in that terminology?
So like, for example...
gnomes, I know.
Gnomes were associated with earth. Mermaids or undines were associated with water. And then air sylphs or fairies were associated with air. Yeah.
Right. Well, and you mentioned healing. Well, we can't get away from the fact that there's a lot of ancient healing system, but also contemporary. If you go to natural nature medicine and stuff like that, you will encounter the four humors, as they call it.
Oh, yeah, correct. Yeah, the four.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, the Hylek and the sanguine and the... I can't. I'm drawing.
Yeah, phlegmatic and choleric.
Right, choleric. That's right.
Yeah. So sanguine is connected to air and blood.
Yes.
Phlegmatic to water and phlegma.
Yeah.
Yellow bile to fire, that's choleric.
Yeah.
And black bile to earth, that's melancholic.
Yeah.
And I believe the anthroposophists, the Rudolf Steiner system, they're big on that one.
Okay.
Because they don't just regard it as medicinic in the body, although they have the medicine system. They also regard it as four character types. I guess related to the temperament types you were talking about.
Yeah. I've seen there seems to be a resurfacing of some of this idea of these different personality types, and how they call them different things now, but it's still...
Yeah, the Jungian system is based on the four elements.
Yep, that's right.
Don't you mention that in the book?
I do, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we have the extroverted, the introverted, and then we have intuitive type, thinking type, feeling type, sensation type, and they both come in a masculine extrovert and feminine introvert version.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, I think we'll take a break at that highlight, and when we come back, we'll go even deeper into the elements. Tim will tell you about their qualities.
All right.
And I'll throw in even more examples of the fourfoldness, and we'll muse a little more in how you deal with them in your book. Sounds okay?
Sounds great.
Mm-hmm.
All of our files are free and will remain free. If you like the show, you can show support by donating $1 to help with expenses. Just use the PayPal link on our website, YouTube channel, or Facebook page. Thanks.